We've been asked to discuss new markets and the challenges in the risky business of sports betting. And we know how important this is for the overall health of integrity of sport, and the relationship between betting on sport and sport itself is a very, very touchy area. There's good and, unfortunately, some grey cloud there. Mostly silver lining, I hope, and that's what we're going to discuss first. I just want to check before I do that and get my notes up here that my fellow panelists are here. Okay, I can't see them yet. I don't know if we're going to be able to see them. I'm going to trust that they're there, but I'm going to... Oh, awesome. Okay, cool. Oh, there we go. Hey, Martin. Hey, guys. Right, okay. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself, not because people don't know, what your job title and name is. I think that's obvious. What I would like is to humanize this process a little bit, because it's all quite remote at a distance like this, and to tell us, each one of you, and I'm going to start with Afi here, because he's the privilege of sitting here with me, about how you got into the sports betting world. What was your intro, your sort of personal interest in this?
Thanks, Ian. Just I think I can't tell. Is it yes? No?
Doesn't sound like it.
Oh, that's better. Sorry. Me and technology. There you go. Hello. What was the question? Why did I get into sports betting? I suppose I'm not really into sports betting, but I'm into what you can see from sports betting, and that is anti-match fixing work. So my interest is to look at what happens in sports betting markets and seeing if we can detect when match fixing is taking place. I always describe it as a crime scene. Not that that's to say that everything that happens in sports betting is a crime scene, of course, but there are elements where you can detect unusual betting market activity, and that is my key interest in this subject. Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, pretty much the same as me then. Until match fixing scandals in 1999 with Hansi Cronje.
Yes.
And those guys, I didn't really know anything about it at all. Unfortunately, it now makes up a vast chunk of my life. I'm going to ask Martin. Martin, I'm hoping you're there to tell us how you became involved in sports betting, what your interest is.
Very good afternoon, everybody. I am here indeed. Apologies that I can't be there with you in person. I'm not a robot. I'm a human being. I'm sitting here in California today. Thanks for this opportunity. Thanks for having me. Boa tarde. Espero que todos estejam bem. My wife happens to be Brazilian, so I'm showing off a little bit. Not really speaking proper Portuguese. Anyway, in terms of how I've got involved, I've been with the online betting and gambling industry for over 13 years by now, which very likely shows my no longer so tender age, and I've been enjoying the ride. I'm also an avid sports fan, and hopefully it won't come across as contradictory. At the same time, I'm not really a betting man. So last night here, I was watching the Seahawks-Broncos game. A lot of thrills, and I didn't really need the additional thrill of betting, although I'm doing fantasy leagues, pick them, and what have you. Long story short, from my perspective, the perspective of somebody who's coming from within the online sports betting and gambling industry, the integrity of the game that actually, or the games that give us the opportunity to offer our products and services is absolutely sacrosanct. And in my Entain capacity, Entain happening to be one of the world's largest online gambling operators. As you might know, we own brands such as Bwin, Sporting Bet, Ladbrokes, BetMGM here in the States. It is in our interest to continue helping protect the integrity of the game. I will come on to it. But very long story short, we happen to have a dedicated sports integrity team. We've been working with Ian, good to see you, Ian, on the esports side of things. And we also happen to have a whole army of traders that also do help us protect the golden goose here, i.e. the game. So thanks again for having me today.
Thanks, Martin. Adrian, I'm hoping you're there with us. How about you? How did you get into sports betting?
Oh, is that better? Can you hear me
there
now?
we go.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, apologies for being remote. Lots going on in this country there at the moment. In short, so first of all, I work for Football Data Co. We're a joint venture between the Premier League and English Football League, so we represent all the data rights of professional football here in Great Britain, including the Scottish leagues. I did have a short stint working for Coral many years ago, but I think that was before, well, really about the start of the internet. So I sort of had a little skirmish with the betting industry then, but principally my involvement has come through being sports right holder side. And I've worked in football at the Arsenal Football Club, also worked in horse racing, basically marketing audiovisual and data rights. And here I am today at Football Data Co. and data or part of the data that we provided to the betting industry, and what comes with that is some sense about what integrity means. So that's a bit about me.
Thanks, Adrian. And last but not least at all, and a very interesting one from my perspective, the only one that I haven't really worked with ever before, but I'm super interested in, Joe Solosky from NASCAR. Joe, how did you get this role? It's incredible.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone for having me, and also appreciate everyone for the technology that allows me to be here remote. I wish I was in Portugal right now, but I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. Yeah, I mean, my background and my entry into sports betting is not replicable, and I think a little unique. But I started off my career in the U.S. military and intelligence community. And when my wife actually was in the Army and she got stationed overseas in Germany in 2015, and when I moved over there, I resigned from my previous roles, and I was a huge sports fan, and just started writing for a sports technology blog when I moved over to Germany, and saw how mature sports betting was in Europe. And I thought, this was well before PASPA in the US, and I just thought this is a really interesting industry, and maybe one day we'll become live in the US. And I got a job with Sportradar as an account manager, and I really learned sports betting inside and out from working in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And then when it came time to move back to the US in 2018, PASPA was repealed, and I stayed with Sportradar for another 3 years. I enjoyed being in the sports betting industry from the data side, but I really wanted to go somewhere where I could use my expertise in the US in an industry or a league or an organization that didn't have any knowledge in the space. So I started to look at different leagues, and NASCAR was at a time where they were looking for someone to oversee their sports betting division, and luckily I was selected to do so. So I started that role in March of last year. So I've been here at NASCAR for a year and a half.
Thanks very much. It's fascinating, and I've got a bunch of questions for you. But we're going to focus on sports betting generally first before we look at new markets. I want to explore the positive aspects of that relationship between sports betting and sports, and what sports betting brings to sport. We know that sport brings a lot of profit to sports betting, but the other way around, what do each of you see as the principal benefits of the relationship, the existence of sports betting for sport? Afi, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Ian. I think probably speaking as a sports fan, which I am massively, the fan engagement aspect, I think it kind of brings a dimension to your enjoyment of sports that perhaps previously wasn't there, or at least wasn't so visible. And the technology now, and the markets available, and the ease with which sports fans can interact with the sport and the spectacle they're watching in front of them in a different way, is probably what sports betting brings to sports. I suppose it makes people have another sort of interest in what's going on in front of them. And then there's, of course, the business side of things, and what sports betting brings in terms of the betting operators and sponsorships, and we've seen plenty of that, certainly in the UK, with regards to money going into sports. I think they're the two obvious ones.
Yeah, and that fan engagement, obviously, I can attest to seeing the difference between in esports, where markets are offered and where markets are not offered. It's absolutely essential, actually, to the success or otherwise of a tournament. Where we faced integrity issues, for example, and had certain tournaments removed from the major visible platforms where esports is available, those tournaments die because they're not reflected in the betting markets or on the broadcast. It's a very, very interesting world. Adrian, I'm particularly interested in your view from the football perspective, given that it's the largest alongside horse racing of the sports betting products in the world. What do you think betting on football brings to football?
Yeah, I think sport generally has a sort of slightly contradictory relationship with betting, is my sort of personal view. You can't stop it, and it has some issues around integrity, and I'm sure we'll get there. So I don't think it's kind of universally great from a sports point of view, but it is there. And as Appy says, I think the whole engagement piece is significant, and I think clearly in the States that's massive at the moment. I think in Europe, particularly in the UK, we've had it for a long time. We almost take it for granted. I think it's part of the history, part of the furniture. So we sort of take a slightly different view. So I think it is a sort of slightly vexed question. But given the history, you can't suddenly put it back in a box and pretend it's not happening. So I think beyond the fan engagement piece, clearly there is a commercial relationship between football and betting, principally in sponsorship. That's under threat, depending on what happens to our government and its gambling review, but we won't bore you with that. And I think there's probably an argument also to be made that when it does come to integrity, actually, reputable bookmakers and sport share the same interests, because actually no one wants there to be integrity issues, whether you're a betting operator or whether you're sport. So in fact, that there is a way you can find to work together to mutual gain in that regard. So I think it is multidimensional, and it is complicated, certainly for football. I think other sports, you've got like horse racing, where there's a very different relationship with betting. They are inextricably linked, and I think we can have a different conversation about that. But I think with football, it is multifaceted. But there are benefits, but there are concerns as well.
Before I let you go on that, Adrian, one of the things that I've noticed, particularly as esports betting develops, is that it has turned what was interesting data, match data, which was really just a media product for the most part, into a highly valuable asset of the tournament organizer or of the rights owner in whichever sport you're dealing with. You guys are obviously in the process of monetizing data. And how do you find that is that a new income stream for sport, or is it just is it only reflected in sponsorship? Is value generated through the data in different ways?
I think in the case of Dataco and English football, it always has been, I say always, for a long time it has been a revenue source. If you go back in time and think of only the pools, for example, the pools used to generate quite a lot of money that came into football. People will probably forget what pools used to be, but that started a long time ago. And clearly that's been replaced by fixed odds betting and the digital take-up of fixed odds betting. So yes, there has always been a relationship. It has been commercial. And I think, outside of the sponsorship, data is the only way we find a way to monetize the relationship with betting, because there's no, apart from horse racing, which has a levy, there is no regulation in this country, and with the possible exception of Australia and France, no legislation in the world that sort of creates a defined link between sports betting and the sport. So certainly from our point of view, data is one way we can try and get some kind of fair return. I think, I can get very subjective and say whatever we make is tiny compared to what the betting industry makes, but that's kind of in the margins. The reality is, yes, data can help create some commercial transaction between sport and betting.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. You're more in that world of taking some raw data and turning it into markets. I'm not going to ask you about levies and the direct relationship between sport and betting companies on that front. But in light of what Afi and Adrian have already said, do you see there being additional benefits to sport of the existence of sports betting, or has everything been said already?
Well, first of all, I would have been happy to address the potentially controversial question. I would agree with Adrian that there hasn't necessarily been a passionate love between betting and the likes of football and other sports, so rather a decent relationship, if in some cases not tolerance, but as I'm sure the audience would know, for example, the US major leagues, I suppose, as always, in my view, they've done a really good job in terms of monetizing their data, and I'm sure that they will continue doing that. To the other point, sports betting has been around since, I suppose, time immemorial and is here to stay. So I would suggest that we've really moved on from what you may want to call the wild, wild west of the original launch of all online gambling products 10 15 years ago. So the bottom line being that regulation is a good thing, and regulation should and will have, in my view, help us address some of the thornier issues that we have been alluding to on this call. So as long as we all exist, both sports and sports betting, in a regulated environment, that's a very solid foundation to have. In terms of the other benefits, I only relocated to the US some 11 months ago, but I would say that not only the major leagues, but also the likes of NASCAR, many other organizations, I think those guys, looking at Joe, you have done a phenomenal job in terms of monetizing the opportunity, but also drawing the lines of what is and what is not acceptable. So really, to my mind, there are two key benefits. Ultimately, I'm a regulatory lawyer. So as I've already said, regulation is a good thing, and we're much better off having regulated sports betting, including in the US, as opposed to having those who choose to do that sneakily pop down the pub and speak to one of those shady illegal bookmakers there. So that's the first thing. And secondly, having admitted that I'm not a betting man myself, I do believe that it provides additional excitement and thrills and additional layers and additional value to the likes of the TV coverage and all the entertainment that is associated with the game, of course, as long as betting is done within reason, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, as long as we have very, very robust protocols in place designed to protect the game itself, and also, crucially and critically, protect the viewership, protect the public, and protect those who will have chosen to wager.
Thank you. Yes, I couldn't agree more in terms of the improvement in regulation. I think obviously in the United States there's a long way to go. We'll probably talk about that more in the sessions on Thursday, where we're dealing more directly with integrity. But in the esports world, we know that there are millions of bettors on esports in the United States, more or less all of whom are felons because they're betting illegally. And so the regulation is going to improve that landscape as the regulation improves. It's still got a long way to go. But Joe, I've left you till last because this is super interesting. I'm going to ask you why NASCAR looked at this and created this role, and really, was it reactive to the dangers of the existence of betting on NASCAR, or was this proactively because NASCAR see benefits in an engagement with the sports betting industry?
Yeah, I would say it's the latter. I was not around when NASCAR made the decision to kind of lean into sports betting. However, now that I've been here for a year and a half and kind of understanding the decision-making process of why we got involved, it truly was to grow the fan base. I mean, we all knew prior to PASPA, there was any estimate of $100 to $300 billion a year being bet on sport, tens of millions of Americans doing so offshore. And now we can see reports from a regulated industry across 20 plus states with mobile betting. Tens of billions of dollars are being wagered legally onshore, with regulated sports books, and tens of millions of Americans are betting on sports now, legally and onshore. So prior to PASPA, NASCAR was not really a sport that people wagered on. Part of that was because NASCAR moves at such a speed, and our full field of athletes and cars are not typically available or seen on a TV field. So it's hard to kind of scout that and provide data feeds. But now with an official NASCAR data feed, we can easily provide that to a data supplier, to sports books, and markets can be made on NASCAR. So we viewed this, and we still view it, as a way to grow the sport and grow our fan base. So, like I said, there are tens of billions of dollars being wagered on sports right now onshore, tens of millions of fans who may not be watching NASCAR. And if there's a way for sportsbook operators to provide an attractive NASCAR betting product, that might be a top of the funnel mechanism for someone who's betting on NFL or NBA or EPL to then dip their toes in betting on NASCAR. And because they bet on NASCAR, they'll watch the race on TV. And if they watch the race on TV, then they might attend an event and become a fan. And that's really kind of the bottom line, and the way that we look at how sports betting is going to help grow the sport.
Thank you. And please stay on, because I wanted to start with you on the next question that overlaps partly with what you've just said here, is that we're here to look at new markets, and NASCAR being a blindingly obvious one for the reasons that you've just outlined here. And I'm only making assumptions here, but I think it may be that the viewership in the United States is, if not peaked, then at least kind of at a level that might be satisfactory to you. Does your remit as head of sports betting at NASCAR include working with the expansion of the broadcast and engagement outside the United States? Because I think for many, many people, perhaps even in this room, have only the vaguest notion of what NASCAR is and why it's a unique series within the broader motorsport offering.
It's a very small part, honestly, of what I'm doing now, although it's something that I'm keenly aware of, especially having worked overseas and in different markets in sports betting. Obviously, there's so much going on, and I have a team of two right now at NASCAR. So really, our focus is on the U.S. as states continue to legalize, and we're involved in that process. So the U.S. is certainly our number one focus. However, we do have a relationship with live streaming in markets outside of the U.S., where NASCAR is shown on sports betting apps and retail shops overseas. It's not a hugely engaged audience. However, NASCAR does have series that are overseas in Canada, Mexico, Europe, and we're looking at potentially offering data feeds on those sports once the sport continues to grow more internationally. But to be honest, it's not a huge focus of ours right now, just because the engagement from the international audience is not there yet, and the focus really is domestically in the U.S.
Thanks. Gents, going back to you, Afi, in terms of new markets, I know Starlizard has its very kind of focused efforts on particular activities, but do you see, in your personal experience, new markets that have some kind of viability or potential in the sports betting arena?
I think...
And sorry, let me be clear. At this stage, I'm talking about new sports or new aspects of sport rather than new markets as in demographics, geography. So not new markets as, Africa's a new market. But for now, what sports might be interesting as new markets or activities?
I think the more general point there is that it's, like most industries, innovation is key. And particularly, I think, in the sort of entertainment sort of the society that we have now, and fast entertainment is very much a thing. People constantly scroll past things all the time, and having a fixed product, I don't think is something that's necessarily going to stand the test of time in isolation. So I think it's very important that new markets are explored by the betting industry, and I think working together with sports in order to do that responsibly is particularly important. You could cast the net and pull up a whole load of sports that you might then start looking at integrity issues around whether that's, and by integrity issues, it's quite a wide ranging definition in itself. But how low should you go when it comes to collecting new markets? And there's all sorts of ethical discussions that go on around youth matches, for example. And so I think I think innovation is very important. I think new markets need to be explored, but I do think it's something that needs to be done responsibly, carefully, together with the sports. And that's probably the best approach.
Thanks. Yeah, obviously I agree. In the esports context, particularly, new games are coming up all the time, and there's a temptation to leap in, regardless of what that community for that particular game is like. Adrian, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in football, I don't think we see very much innovation, quite frankly, and Afi would know more about this than I. I think the innovation we've seen is much more around derivatives of standard bets than bets per se. But I would probably agree that in the long run, that probably needs to change if the market's going to continue to sort of grow in the way that it has been. So it's an interesting point. I would think that you have mature sports like football. The opportunity must be for new sports, but I think that does come with some risks. When it comes to integrity, I mean, I think certainly some of the stakeholders that I have really, for example, don't particularly like what Americans call prop bets, which is effectively spot betting during live in the game, because I think that's an integrity risk. Now, I think we deal with it, and it happens, and it's popular. But if you're a new sport, I think you have to be quite careful with those sorts of things. So I suppose what I'm saying is innovation, I agree with Afi, is a really good thing, and it's what needs to drive the industry forward. I think there's not a great deal of it when it comes to bet types. So I think there are potentially new opportunities in new sports, but I think you have to tread carefully with that.
Yeah, thanks. Martin, I'd like you to mention Entain's view on esports as a new market, but more broadly, is there anything else on the horizon for you guys that you see as having viability and potential in terms of sports, rather than new markets as in types of bet, which is something I actually want to go back to Joe on, because as soon as I heard that NASCAR was on this panel, I immediately thought about 30 types of in-play betting that would be interesting in the NASCAR context. But anything other than that, other than esports in your world, Martin?
Well, I suppose during the pandemic, and this is a semi-jokey point, the likes of Mongolian table tennis and Belarusian basketball had their brief renaissance during the pandemic, but luckily we have moved on. So in terms of the future, first of all, yeah, I do believe that as an industry we do need to go with the times. And to your question, Ian, there's absolutely no doubt that in particular the younger generation, I'm not saying young, so younger, all these video gamers now, I'm not saying growing old yet, but certainly they are getting more and more mature. So long story short, we at Entain, but across the industry, we're looking into ways of integrating ever so more prominently an esports offering into our portfolio of products, subject, and I believe this actually is a good opportunity for esports as well. And you've been leading the charge, if not blazing the trail, in connection with esports integrity. But it certainly Entain's intention to apply the same consumer protection and in particular responsible gambling and esports integrity protocols to his esports offering. So most definitely esports is one, it's an evolving concept, but there's a variety of options. I suppose the usual fallacy is to just using the very broad brush to talk about esports, because to your other point, there's a huge number of games. So yeah, again, jokingly, I was talking about the likes of Mongolian table tennis. Well, then in the same breath, we could be talking, less jokingly so, of course, about Dota 2 and League of Legends and all the NBA games. So these are the individual esports. Two final points, if I may, in terms of perhaps not, well, at this stage exotic, but hopefully going forward alternative gambling products. A lot of sports betting and gambling operators have been looking into launching hybrid casino and sports products, i.e., we would be using certain features of sports and implant them into casino or card games. So that, I believe, is also the music of the future. And then finally, without trying to steal Joe's thunder, I believe that prop bets are not a bad thing, indeed, to Adrian's point, as long as they're properly managed, because the likes of baseball, football as in American football, to some extent basketball, even hockey, and of course, well, cricket to what extent that may be popular here in the States, but it's definitely a big game globally. They lean themselves towards prop bets, and I strongly believe that both from the sports integrity and responsible gambling perspective, we'd be much better off having this type of bets permitted, because then they would sit in that controlled and controllable regulated environment and would further help the industry to bring or steer customers away from all the shady tentacles of the black market. So that would be my take on the future of the betting industry in conjunction with developments in the world of sports and sports integrity.
Thanks, Martin. If you could stay with us, the other meaning of new markets being geographic markets and expansion into those, and obviously more or less every betting company in the world right now, at least on the license front, is focused on the United States in the hope that nascent market of new bettors as well as existing bettors who currently operate in the illegal space could be converted into higher spenders in the regulated space. But there are other parts of the world, believe it or not, for us, and we look at South America, Africa, the more difficult regions of Southeast Asia and China, for example, where currently most sports betting is prohibited. Do you think that firstly, is there potential in those geographic markets, and I'm thinking particularly of South America and Africa in that context? We know the potential of Asia, but do you think the regulatory setup is sufficient in those new markets to actually protect the consumer? Or is it, in effect, does the good regulation need to come first? Or is this just a ripe area for exploitation, ready to pick for the right betting operators? Martin first.
Sure, I strongly believe that the regulation does need to come first, but hand in hand with that, and that's what we've lately experienced in the likes of Brazil, is the need to remove the stigma associated with betting. And I believe that we are actually landing there. For 4, 5, 6 years ago, any Brazilian president wouldn't have dared even talk about sports betting in the public. So to answer your question, Ian, yes, I do believe that in particular in Latin America, the atmosphere and the environment are both ripe for regulation. Colombia being the shining Latin American light, they regulated their online sports betting market quite some time ago, and I would strongly suggest that the other Latin American nations, especially those who are in the throes of regulating, the likes of Peru, Chile, and especially Brazil, would be best advised to factor in. I'm not saying copy paste. I'm saying factor in the Colombian regulatory scheme and then introduce the applicable cultural idiosyncrasies or cultural idiosyncrasies that apply to their countries. So I believe Latin America, we will hear a lot about Latin America on the betting and gambling side of things in the very foreseeable future. Africa, just one word, I believe that Africa is bound to be, well, that's not a one word, but it's bound to be more challenging. Having said that, from the pure commercial perspective, there's a huge opportunity, not necessarily for internet betting, but most definitely for mobile betting. The upside of all that being the one that I've been banging on about already, i.e. rooting out the black market while making sure that the global operators, as well as the local operators, apply the same high, very solid consumer protection standards that we have deployed elsewhere.
Adrian, I'd like your view on what Martin's had to say in the original question about geographic markets, particularly for your product, your football product. What's your view on the potential new markets that exist geographically or culturally?
I mean, to be honest, not my strong point, because we work with partners who would have a better view than I. And in fact, probably what I need to do is get Martin to come as my translator and go a little tour of South America, because that sounds like a very sensible thing to do, so I get a bit better acquainted with it. I mean, I think on a serious note, there are lots of mature markets, and certainly in the case of football, you know, growth comes with TV rights in new territories, and I think betting follows, really, if it wasn't there in the first place. So you look at Latin America, it's a huge market. I mean, you know, there is a role for English football there, but I think their domestic market's so strong that probably that's where the real opportunity is. If you're looking at sport, converting that interest in betting into money, it's got to be the local football, the local product, because that's so strong. Obviously, I think from our perspective, we're incredibly strong in Asia, but that's a very difficult market. It's, you know, it is not regulated, it's huge, and no one really can tap into it. So yes, I think there definitely are opportunities, clearly, but the one that really sits out there as difficult to manage, but would be fantastic if you could somehow control it, would be Asia.
Yeah, thanks very much. Joe, unless you've got something particular to say on that question, or Afi, I'm going to move on to the notion that we've looked at new markets, but the other side of our panel title is the challenges that are created by both new markets and the simple existence of sports betting and the relationship with the sports themselves. Sport betting, by its nature, and probably the great thing that underpins it, is risky business, as we said in the title. But who bears the risk when it comes to the integrity of both the practice of betting, but more importantly, from probably Afi and me on the stage, the integrity of sport, competitive integrity? So the impact of betting on integrity of what happens on the field. Who bears the risk of that? Afi, I'm going to start with you, and I know it's a multifaceted answer, but you're really the expert on this that's sitting with us today.
It is a multifaceted answer. I think everyone bears a responsibility. I don't think anyone should put their hands up and say, right, it's got nothing to do with me. No, if you're involved in the kind of transaction, as it were, in some way, then I think we should all bear responsibility. Sports are responsible, in my view, sports are responsible for ensuring the integrity of sports, and betting companies are responsible for ensuring the integrity of betting. And when there's an overlap between the two, I think then that responsibility is shared. I think the challenges of what we've talked about, they are multifaceted, and you've got challenges that come particularly with issues like responsible gaming and how that balances with fan engagement. But then also, you know, in my line of work on perhaps what is traditionally referred to as sports betting integrity, even though I don't like the term as such, so I think it's too widely encompassing. But you know, the risk of corruption and match fixing that comes from this. You know, I think you open up new markets and you bring geographically a new market into a particular location. I think therefore, you know, whilst it may not be, it may not have such a big impact when it comes to the organised kind of match fixers and corruptors who exploit global betting markets, but you know, on a local level, you know, there's a route to market suddenly for that athlete's friend who's got inside information, or you know, who wants to walk down the street and put a bet on in that respect. So you know, I think there's all sorts of challenges that come from that, but I think the burden is shared across all the actors.
I'd like to pass on the same question, firstly to Joe and then on to Martin. But Joe, this must overlap with aspects of your current job. What do you think the biggest risks are to NASCAR, betting on NASCAR, and what are you doing within your role to mitigate that? Whose problem is the threat to the integrity of NASCAR competition?
Well, I think from a motorsports industry perspective, it's on NASCAR, or I guess when it comes to the NASCAR industry, it's on NASCAR to educate all members who fall under our policy of sports betting. So, our policy is that any NASCAR employee or driver cannot bet on the sport of NASCAR. So that's on us to educate our drivers, our employees, anyone who's involved in the sport of what they can and can't do. We also have to explain to them why they can't do that, why it's important that the integrity of our sport is maintained now with the legalization of sports betting and with the involvement of sponsorships, why they can't bet on the sport. So that's something that we are very involved in from a collaborative, industry-wide collaboration. When it comes to the end consumer on responsible gambling and education on that front, I think it's shared between NASCAR and our partners being the sports betting operators. So there's a messaging aspect from our sportsbook operating partners to their customers of responsible gaming. And there's also, I think, a imperative on NASCAR to educate our fans and consumers if they are betting on other operators who aren't partners of ours to also do so responsibly. When it comes to risk, in terms of your first question, I think the biggest risk is just, if we don't do a good job educating our drivers, athletes, employees enough, and it is, there is a scandal, as we've seen in other sports, around an athlete betting on the sport. Fortunately, that has not happened. And I think that's in large part due to the collaboration among our competition, sports betting, our teams on making sure that that's known and why that policy is in place. So I think it's, from a motorsport industry perspective, it's on NASCAR to do that education to the industry. And then when it comes to the actual fan and consumer, that is a shared responsibility between the sportsbook operators and NASCAR.
And before I pass on to Martin, I had a very specific question. This is my obsession with NASCAR, by the way. Sorry. I've got this opportunity. But one of the things that struck me is almost every sport has a rule or regulations within their betting-related rules and regulations to do with the abuse of inside information. This is very, very common. It's actually the most difficult gray area in any sport to explain to the participants. But it struck me that in motorsport and in NASCAR, you have a large group of people, relatively large group of people, who have in-depth technical inside information, your pit crew, your setup, your telemetry access, and all of these things. To what extent does your education as NASCAR drop down into everybody occupying the pit box? Because these are guys who know not something as basic as tire choice, because that's pretty standardized, but for example, set up on a tri-oval where you've got different cambers, and there's these constant micro adjustments that are made within your level of motorsport that are actual gold in terms of information to bettors. What are you doing about that specific area, the abuse of inside information?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a good point. And I do think that NASCAR is uniquely positioned in that sense. So one of the ways that we address that is through our integrity partnership with Sport Radars and our integrity partners. So every year there is a tutorial that every NASCAR member, which includes team owners, drivers, pit crew, anyone who has access to that kind of information, goes through. And that talks specifically about insider information, match fixing, integrity generally, but specific to your point, match fixing and the access to that type of information. So there's education sessions around that. And actually next year, we'll be doing a in-person tutorial as well to all of those members who do have access to that information. That kind of hits on that even further in depth, because we are, like I said, uniquely positioned in that sense of so many people having access to this information. So it's something that we are very keenly aware of, and it's something that we address from not just one angle, but multiple angles, from a tutorial aspect to an in-person training aspect.
Thanks very much. Yeah, an area of personal interest. So sorry to bug you on that one. But also to end, Martin, in terms of the formal questions from me, if we have time, if there are any questions from the audience. But Martin, your view on those risks that we've been discussing in this last section and what Entain is particularly doing. This is, directly in your wheelhouse. What are you guys doing to mitigate the risk, not just to Entain, but to the sport, the sports on which you offer markets?
Absolutely, the onus is on the industry and its individual members to educate and, if not evangelize, not just our employees, our customers, but also the wider public. And we've been working, well, in this particular case, on the responsible gambling side of things, that's effectively across the consumer protection piece with a number of organizations at both ends of the pond. On top of that, as I believe I would have very briefly mentioned in my introduction, just like many competitors of ours, we do have a dedicated sports integrity team that anytime they may come across something untoward, if not fishy and suspicious while monitoring the markets, they would raise hue and cry, metaphorically speaking. Practically speaking, they would raise an alert and pass that suspicion or information on to the other industry operators, as well as the sports governing bodies and leagues with whom we happen to have data sharing agreements and other types of memoranda of understanding. And on top of that, and that will be the final point, if I may, we also happen to have nearly 500 traders, and perhaps sometimes misleadingly the public may think that these are just the guys who are setting the odds. Well, yes, that is their primary job, but most of them, if not all of them, are avid sports fans, and they are specialized in their individual sporting areas, which means two things. While setting the odds, they get a lot of information to get it right. For that reason, they would watch a lot of sport and have the ability to detect any untoward behavior. So that's many other pairs of eyes on every single game. And also, really, their function is permeated by the spirit of protecting the integrity of the sport. So they would be the first ones to raise these alarms and work very closely together with the sports integrity team. So a very long story short, the onus is on us, and we will intend to continue doing our part. It's not only the right thing to do, but it also will help protect the integrity of the sport and ultimately also the integrity of our industry.
Thank you. I can give direct testimony to that. In fact, with respect to Ladbrokes Australia, which is one of the Entain group, our biggest case in esport, where we ended up banning 37 young Australian players for betting on Counter-Strike during a competition during which they were playing Counter-Strike, was as a direct result of one of Ladbrokes Australia's traders noticing strange patterns within the betting on that particular league, on that particular series, and off his own bat digging into who was placing those bets and finding that not only were the players placing bets and having accounts, but also digging further that brothers, sisters, wives, cousins, fathers, friends were also betting, and that helped us directly break our biggest case. So that synergy and that cooperation between a sports regulator, because we're not a governing body, but and the sport and the betting industry is tremendous testimony to that work. But I still think, of course, that there's a long way to go in that relationship, because currently there is still that massive gray area, not only between the regulated industry and sport, but also, of course, greatly so between the unregulated, illegal gray and black markets that exist in sports betting and sport, where there's just pure profit and exploitation on one side and consequence on the other. So I would like to ask if there are any questions from the audience. We've probably got a minute for one question. All right. Oh, there we go. Sorry. I thought we'd bored you all to death.
Do you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Emina Boskoort. In the past, I was a member of European Parliament and worked on legislation considering market abuse legislation, consisting also of insider dealing. What struck me was that there was quite similarities also when it comes to supervisory organizations watching match fixing, but also watching markets. And what I wanted to ask is couldn't it be a good possibility to team up because there's a lot of legislation in the United States, but also in Europe, considering insider dealing. So for the prosecution of match fixing irregularities, couldn't that be a good example to be able to prosecute better also match fixing?
I'll tell you what I think on this and then open it to the panel, because this is a very interesting area. Because it differs so dramatically, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, it is very useful in some places and of absolutely no use in others. And the issue that we face is that certainly, and I think this applies to most sports betting, but certainly in esports betting, it's a global activity. And what we often witness is an event that is perhaps controlled on a server in Germany by a tournament organizer based in Sweden, a team based in Peru, and a team based in... It's a very global activity, particularly online. We find that jurisdictionally it's very, very difficult. And to find somebody with the will and resources to cooperate in that kind of investigation and a criminal law and system that actually is either interested and fit for purpose is very, very difficult. So it's very much, in my view, left to sport or the industry itself to deal with these problems itself. Because I can think, in my experience, of probably 2 or 3 jurisdictions where if you pass the relevant information to the relevant authority, something actually happens. In 98% of the time, nothing happens. It disappears into a black hole and you never hear of it again. The Macallan Convention is definitely going to help that, for sure, but we're probably a decade away from that being genuinely effective. Outside of the biggest, sexiest scandals, where people will pick up on it because it's high profile. The day-to-day match fixing, you can't get the relevant authorities interested. I'm afraid that's just the truth.
I could literally talk for hours on this, and I won't, because you'll all be thoroughly bored. But if I could just use football as an example, and I've been advocating that football considers setting up an independent integrity agency to look at anti-match fixing investigations, particularly because when it comes to best practice, as Ian says, it varies so much jurisdictionally. There's some very good examples of football governing bodies doing an excellent job on match fixing or suspected match fixing. There are also some more unfortunate examples of it not really being given the attention it duly deserves. And I think if you look at it from a governance perspective, there's a conflict of interest here, because you've got a governing body that is set up a tournament. It needs the commercial success of a tournament. There's broadcasting rights, there's sponsorship, there's a lot of money involved, and tournaments have to be successful. And so when they're also charged with looking at things that threaten the success of that tournament, there has to be a conflict there. And I'm not suggesting that every governing body is conflicted in that way in reality, because there are, as I said, there are some good examples of good anti-match fixing work by governing bodies. But when you've got money and power versus integrity, sometimes it's not necessarily an evenly balanced equation. So I think if you look at what tennis has done, tennis has set up an international tennis integrity agency, independent from the governing bodies, funded by the governing bodies, but independent in terms of its setup, board structure, operational independence to investigate what it wants to investigate, allegations of match fixing, but imperatively it has the power to sanction, and that is what we come back to here. What happens at the end of it. So that's my tuppence worth anyway.
Thanks so much, Jaffe. we're out of time. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the panel that were online, and thank you.
Thanks for having us. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.